Welcome to the first semester of Introductory Biology Online with Dr. Jason Laughlin, an online course that considers the basic principles of biology, including the nature of science, chemistry important for biology, cytology, biological energetics, mitosis and meiosis, genetics, DNA, gene regulation, evolution, populations, and ecology. If you have a question for Dr. Laughlin, be sure to post it on the course discussion board. Now, here's Dr. Laughlin.
All right, welcome to General Biology 1 Online. This is Dr. Laughlin. I'll be your instructor this semester. Today is the first lecture of the course, The Nature of Science, and today's topic, we're attempting to understand what science is, what biology is, why biology is a science, and what are things called pseudosciences, and why are they not sciences? Let's talk a little bit about those things today in this lecture. Well, this is a biology course, and so let's start off with the biological definition. What exactly is biology? There are a few definitions, as you may, of course, appreciate. The one that many people like is the scientific discipline that studies all aspects of living things. All right, so biology, one of the definitions that many like is the scientific discipline that studies all aspects of living things. This is a fine definition, and nothing wrong with it, of course. I've underlined living things because we do, of course, need to understand what that is in order to understand what biology is. But this is a fine definition. There is another one that will get you there as well. It's even shorter. It's called, biology would be in this case defined as the science of life. Okay, much shorter and a little more to the point, but also a little more loaded in terms of, well, actually, both of these definitions, you really see both of them. Science and scientific are in there, and living things or life are in there. So we really, in order to appreciate what biology is, we need to talk a little bit about this, and we need to come back in a minute and talk more about science. So life, many people, if you were to ask them, approach them on the street, take them an object and say, what is this? Is this alive or is it not alive? Or was it ever alive? Many people would be able to intuitively know that. They would have an answer for you, and they may not know necessarily why they consider alive or not alive, but they would have most people would have a pretty firm answer. So interestingly enough as well, many of you purchased a rather expensive textbook for this course. Many college textbooks are overpriced, but there we are. And your book may have been $150 to $250, and when you look in the back of your biology textbook and you look in the glossary where all of those terms are defined, a lot of the terms are defined, and you look for a definition for life, you just don't find it. Many biology textbooks, which are there to explain what we know about biology, the science of life, don't really have a definition in the glossary of what they're actually about, which is kind of interesting. And the reason I think for that is because many biologists just can't agree on a nice, concise definition of what life is. So what biologists have been able to really agree on, I suppose, or come to a consensus on, is what it takes for an organism or for a thing to be considered alive. What is it exactly that makes something alive? And so there are characteristics of life that biologists have kind of now agreed on, many of them. I bet not all of them, but many of them have now agreed on of what it takes to be truly alive in terms of characteristics. What are the characteristics of life? There's not a nice definition, but there are a handful of characteristics that many will say, yes, I agree. If it has all 7 or 8 of these characteristics, it's alive. Okay? So the first characteristic that all living things have, really no matter how large or how small they are, is that they are composed of cells. So I'll put here cellular composition. Every living thing has cells. It's composed of cells. The smallest living organisms are one cell, and the largest ones are multicellular. Okay, so everything that's alive is composed of cells. Another characteristic is that all living things have metabolism. All right, metabolism. What I mean by metabolism is that all living things take in energy. So I'll put here intake. They also expend energy. So I'm going to put intake and expenditure of energy. That's what metabolism is. That's what I mean by metabolism at this point. So it's got to take in energy. It spends that energy. All living things do that. Okay, the third thing, go to the next page here. The third thing is all living things respond to a stimulus or many stimuli. They have the capacity to respond to external stimuli. Now, this particular characteristic really comes in two forms. There's what's known as adaptability, and then there's irritability. Adaptability and irritability. And I think I misspelled those two terms. Irritability has an I. I think that's better. So adaptability, irritability. The big difference between these two forms of responses has to do with the stimulus. So adaptability, your textbook likely talks about organisms having the capacity to evolve, and that's what I mean by adaptability. They are responding to what I consider long-term stimuli. That's what I mean by adaptability. The organisms are responding to the long-term stimuli. So we think of long-term stimuli like seasonal changes, migration patterns in birds. Those are adaptable traits. They are picking up on external environmental cues, long-term cues, and then they're migrating either north or south, right, to adapt to deal with seasonal changes. That's adaptability. Irritability, on the other hand, is when they respond to short-term stimuli. Okay, it's a response to a short-term stimuli. So we think about, one of the classics is when you're a kid and you touch a hot stove, you immediately pull your hand back. Okay, that's an irritable trait. You put a plant next to a window ledge, and of course it starts growing slowly, but it starts growing to the light, right? And then you flip it around, turn the plant around, and it eventually starts growing back to the light. That is also an irritable trait. It's a relatively short-term stimulus. Right? So all living things have the ability to respond to stimuli. Number 4, all living organisms have some form, or many forms, in fact, of homeostasis, what's known as homeostasis. This term literally means same state. Okay? So what this would be, homeostasis, a good definition, a real brief definition at this point, would be the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. Okay, the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. So we think about humans, or we think about mammals in general, right? Mammals are referred to as homeothermic, meaning we maintain our own body temperature. Okay, we keep it constant, right? We have mechanisms. When you get too hot, your body sweats. When you get too cold, your body shivers, and all these other kinds of cardiovascular things that it does to preserve your temperature, to keep it at a relatively constant level. There's all kinds of homeostatic examples. We've got blood pressure, you've got heart rate, breathing rate, blood pH, blood sugar. All of those things are regulated by homeostasis. Okay, number 5 that all living organisms have, of course, is growth. They grow and they die. Okay, so living organisms grow and die. Number 6, all living things reproduce, or at least have the capacity to reproduce. All right, so all living things have the capacity to reproduce. Of course, if they didn't, they wouldn't be around today for us to even talk about them. Reproduction is extremely important. And number 7, the final thing is that they have genetic material. All living things, whether you're a fungus, a bacteria, a plant, an animal, every living organism through reproduction, passes its genetic material down to the next generation. And of course, the genetic material we know is deoxyribonucleic acid. There is the DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, the genetic material that's universal. Every living organism has genetic material in the form of DNA. So, in a nutshell, that's what biology is. It is the part of that definition, the science of life. Here's the life part. We need to now step back to, in fact, if I go back to that previous slide, we need to come back and talk about this. What is science? We now know at least a little bit about what life is. What exactly is science? So there's a couple of things, maybe a few things in here that I want to talk about in terms of why do we even need to address this? I have a whole lecture devoted to science. What is science? The nature of science. There's a few reasons why I want to talk about this. Number one, what I'm going to say applies to all of the sciences. So I'm talking about biology, I'm talking about physics, I'm talking about math, I'm talking about chemistry, astronomy. All of those sciences will apply to this. Okay, everything I'm going to say applies to all the sciences. Another reason is that few people they never really stop to think what science is all about. And consequently, they really don't understand the process or the parameters within which science must operate. Science cannot do everything. It's very good at what it does do, but it cannot do everything. And when we try to apply science to areas where it can't be applied, we get into some trouble. Okay, we can't do that. We have to understand the parameters within which science must operate. And the third reason, and one that biology really has had some trouble with, is the concern among scientists is that there's a growing trend in society that too many people are accepting non-science things without really even questioning them, right? And you likely know many people who do this all the time. All right, so I want to talk about what science is exactly and give you some examples of how we do science. So science is, I have a definition here in just a second that I want to tell you about, but here's one definition, the one that's really shorter. I'll show you the longer version in just 1 second. Science is a way of knowing. It's a way of knowing. It's not the only way of knowing, of course. There's a lot of ways to know things. But this is one of the ways of knowing. It's also considered to be a body of knowledge about some subject arrived at by a few things. Okay, so science, another definition, considered to be a body of knowledge about a particular subject arrived at by, number one, careful observation, okay, followed by suggestions to explain those observations. All right, so that's key. Number one, it has to be observable. And then you have to follow up with an explanation as to explain it. The second thing is testing whatever suggestion that you came up with. So testing the suggestion. All right, number three, you accept those ideas that were supported by the data or by the test, and you reject those ideas not supported either by the test, supported by, running out of room here, by the test, or by the body of knowledge, the evidence that other people have run through and done this testing with. The key here, this is nothing new to anybody. The key, though, is to understand that science has to be observable. Science cannot begin until you can observe something. It has to be observable. Then you test it. You test the suggestion that, as to why you're observing that, exactly what's happening. You accept those ideas that are supportive, and you reject the ideas that are not supported by the evidence. That's all science really is. Now, there is a good definition here that I'm going to put up here. It's a big one, but it really does outline everything here. It's a systematic method of continuing investigation based on observation, hypothesis testing, measurement, experimentation, and theory building, which leads to more adequate explanations of natural phenomena, explanations that are open to further testing, revision, and falsification, and while not, quote, believed in through faith, they may be accepted or rejected on the basis of evidence. Okay, this is a long definition, but I love this definition. It really gets to the heart. It's very concise. It says a lot of things. It's got hypotheses in here and theories in here, which we'll come back to in just a second and talk about. But this is a really nice definition of science. Okay, it really wasn't until, in terms of when we started doing things that were science, it really wasn't until Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton really emphasized that we should not accept anything unless it goes through the scientific process, unless we test things, right? We shouldn't accept anything unless it's actually been tested. And it really wasn't until the middle of the 19th century when we finally got around to developing techniques of careful observation and fairly unbiased evaluation of the real world, and that, of course, became refined into what's known as the scientific method. So the scientific method is the way that we all know science is actually done. Science is done by the scientific method. And before we actually look at the steps, I want to talk about 3 basic assumptions, because every method has assumptions, and I want to talk about these assumptions. There's 3 that I want to talk about. So the assumptions of the scientific method, number 1 is that natural causes are responsible for what takes place. Okay, it's not due to luck. It's not due to magic. It's not due to some supernatural being that's controlling anything, all right? The basic assumption of the scientific method is that natural causes are responsible for what takes place, all right? The second assumption is that natural laws have always applied everywhere. So natural laws have always applied everywhere. It's not like we have natural laws that are working now that never worked in the past. They always work everywhere. And number 3 is that people perceive natural events the same way. So we're going to perceive, if you see something happening, the assumption of the scientific method is that I'm also going to see it the same way. In other words, you have a huge weather system come in and a tornado wipes out this area, then the assumption is that everybody else is going to perceive that a tornado wiped it out as well. It wasn't a fire, or it wasn't an earthquake, or it wasn't a flood, right? It was a tornado. It was some natural event that everyone would perceive the same way. So in terms of the scientific method, it's actually fairly straightforward, and it's nothing different than what you already do. I'll give you a couple of examples here as we go through the steps, but I also want to talk about a sort of a real-life scientific method explanation or example. So the first step of the scientific method is simply to make an observation. So we want to make an observation. No problem there. Everybody can make an observation. Number 2, we want to formulate a hypothesis. Formulate a hypothesis, 1 or 2. Now, I want to talk a little bit about hypotheses here, and that says formulate. It doesn't look like it now, but it's formulate a hypothesis. There's 2 major kinds of hypotheses. There are what are known as research hypotheses. Sometimes these are called alternate. So these are the same things. Research hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. And these are abbreviated as big H, little a subscript a. That's the research hypothesis. And the research hypothesis is what you think is either causing it or what you're going to expect to find. It's your prediction, sort of, okay? Your research hypothesis is what you think is the case. The other hypothesis is called the null hypothesis. Or we'll talk about null hypotheses here. And the null hypothesis is abbreviated as H, big H, and then there's a sub-zero there, H naught. This is the null hypothesis. And on the null hypothesis, this is the exact opposite. It is a truly opposite statement of the research hypothesis. All right? And it's very difficult. Sometimes you have to set these up exactly to be, every time you have to set them up to be exactly the opposite, but sometimes it's very tricky. And the reason you want to set them up to be truly opposite is because after you've gone through the scientific method, when you have to come to the decision point, whether to reject your research hypothesis or to reject your null hypothesis, you have to reject one of them, and you don't want to have to reject both. So you have to set up your hypotheses in the appropriate way. So let me give you a quick example of this. Let's see. So in the lab manual for the hybrid students, I think we talk about this there. But let's make an observation. Let's say you walk out and you make an observation that all birds have 2 wings. Or actually, you didn't make that observation. You saw a bird. Let's say this is the first time you've ever seen a bird. You saw a bird. I said, oh, that bird has 2 wings. And then you see another bird. And that bird has 2 wings. And then you see another bird. And that bird has 2 wings. And after you see 5 or 10 birds, you kind of come to formulate a little hypothesis that I bet all birds have 2 wings. Right? I bet all birds have 2 wings. That's a research hypothesis. You are putting out there, based on what you've seen, what you expect to find in the future, and that is that all birds probably have 2 wings. The null hypothesis would be a true opposite statement, and it would be that all birds do not have 2 wings. You would not want to say something like, for your null hypothesis, that all birds have 1 wing, or all birds have 3 wings, or all birds have 4 wings. You would literally want to say they do not have whatever I said in the research hypothesis. Okay? It's very important that you set it up that way. All right? Null hypothesis versus a research hypothesis. There's another set of hypotheses that have nothing to do with the null and the research. This is sort of one group of hypotheses. Another group of hypotheses is what I refer to as an observational and an explanational hypothesis. And this is another group of hypotheses that's really kind of important to talk about here for a minute. In an observational hypothesis, it's sort of doing what I just did. You are restating what you see. An observational hypothesis, I go out, I saw, hey, there's 5 birds that have 2 wings. My observational hypothesis is all birds will have 2 wings. And I can test that by just going out and counting or looking at 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 10 million birds. I can go look at that and test that. I can test it by just doing basic observations. All right, that's an observational. I am formulating a hypothesis based on what I see. And I'm basically restating it. An explanational hypothesis is one that is going to attempt to explain why you see that. And that's a completely different technique. It's a completely different question. Why do birds have 2 wings? That's what an explanational hypothesis would address. Why do birds have 2 wings? So it's really important you see the difference there. In explanational hypotheses, you're going to do this. You're going to test those by doing experiments, and you're going to make some draw your conclusions based on ruling out all of the other possibilities that you've tested. And so explanational hypotheses are really difficult to address. Anytime you see why, that's what an explanational hypothesis is getting at, and it's very difficult to answer those kinds of questions. Observational hypotheses are very straightforward, and that's what we're going to focus in this class and in the lab, is the observational hypotheses. Okay, so we're gonna come back and I'm gonna give you some examples here in just 1 second. Well, let's see. I didn't mean to do that, so I want to come back here and let's just erase that. The third thing that you want to do after you formulate it, you make an observation, you formulate a hypothesis. The third step of the scientific method is to test the hypotheses, or hypothesis if you've just done one. So you want to test them. Okay. Number 4, make conclusions. All right, make conclusions. You can only make conclusions based on your test results. Therefore, it's really important that you do your testing the best way that you can. And number 5, and likely the most important part, is to make predictions. Right? If you go through the test and you go through the scientific method and you found, hey, I saw 10 birds that had 2 wings. I therefore hypothesize that all birds will have 2 wings. I then go out and I test it by observing 1,000 birds, and they all had 2 wings. I would make conclusions. My conclusions would be that, hey, it would not be I bet at this point. It would be that all birds do have 2 wings. I tested that by looking at 1,000 birds or 1,000,000 birds or whatever. Then you make predictions, and your predictions would be all birds will have 2 wings. I just tested that. If you didn't have the prediction part there, then we wouldn't have any predictability in our daily lives, right? It would be like you wake up in the morning and everything's brand new. Everything you learned yesterday is gone. So making predictions in your scientific method is a very important thing. It gives us predictability in our daily lives, and it gives us some expectations of what we will find out in nature. Now, these scientific method, I'm going to come back and we're going to do a kind of a real biological example of running through the scientific method. But before I break here, let me kind of give you an explanation that everybody in this class has done, and you don't even think about it. You do the scientific method so quickly all the time that you don't really even think about it. Let's say that you walk into a room, some room in your bedroom or in your house, and you flip on the light switch, and the light switch or the light bulb doesn't come on. All right, so there's an observation. You just made an observation. I flipped on the light switch, the light did not come on. What do you do as soon as that happens? What do 99% of the individuals in this class do as soon as that light switch, or rather as soon as the light bulb didn't come on? Right? What do you do? I do the same thing. And then as I turn the light switch off and I turn it back on. Right? Why do we do that? Well, in your thinking, what you're doing by flipping that switch off and flipping it back on is you're going through the process of thinking. You're formulating a hypothesis, and that is that the light switch it didn't make a good connection or something, right? Something's wrong with the light switch. And you tested that by flipping it off and flipping it back on. That was your test. Your results would be, did the light come back on or not? And if it didn't, you make conclusions. You drew conclusions that it's not the light switch. Right? You do that instantly. Within 3 seconds, you ran through the scientific method. So it doesn't take a PhD to do the scientific method. Everybody does it. It's common sense in a way, but you don't think of the steps, of course, in the way that we've outlined here. So what do you do then? One of the things that you do then is you go back and you say, well, let's try something else. I wonder what else it could be. The light's not on. It's not the light switch. It must be the light bulb. So you go and you grab a light bulb. You replace the light bulb. Your hypothesis was it was the light bulb. The light bulb's out. And you go and grab another one. You replace it. You flip the switch on. And let's say it doesn't come on. The light switch did not come on. Or the light bulb did not come on. What do? You make conclusions. It's not the light bulb. Let's go back to another hypothesis. Another hypothesis is, well, let's see. It could be the breaker. Maybe we blew a switch, blew the breaker. So you go out in the garage, you flip the switch, you go back into the room, you flip the light bulb on or you flip the light switch on, and yes, it comes on. Your conclusion would be that it was the breaker. And now I make a prediction. The next time the light switch doesn't come on, I'm going to probably quickly jump to a hypothesis that it might be the breaker. I might actually check the breaker first before I go through the process of crawling up on a ladder and replacing the bulb. That's predictability. And so that's the beauty of the scientific method. Everybody does the scientific method. You do it on a daily basis. We just don't seem to think of it in terms of the scientific method when we do it that quickly. All right, one last thing I want to talk about before we end this session, this little, I'll take a little break here and we'll pick up with part 2, is the part about scientific hypotheses. Scientific hypotheses must be modifiable. This is one of the other reasons why biology is a science as opposed to other things that are not. And that is because when you make a hypothesis, you have to be able to reject that hypothesis. You have to be able to reject the hypothesis and modify it if necessary. So modification of a hypothesis makes an idea a scientific idea. I will talk about that more later, but you cannot love a hypothesis so much that you can't let it go. You reject hypotheses, you can modify hypotheses, you can accept hypotheses tentatively. You cannot hang on to a hypothesis forever. You can't love it so much you can't let it go. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. We'll take a break, pick up with part 2 in just a minute.